Berlin, April 1940, 4 o'clock in the morning. 30 feet underground, beneath the rubble of a dying city, a young woman's fingers hover over typewriter keys. They're shaking. Not from the cold, not from the Soviet artillery that makes the concrete walls tremble every few seconds, but from the words she's being asked to type. Words that will echo through history. Across the small desk sits a man whose left hand trembles so violently he has to grip it with his right to make it stop. His skin is the color of ash. Deep shadows pool under his eyes. He's only 56 years old, but he looks like death itself, and he is dictating his final testament to the world. I have decided to remain in Berlin. His voice is flat, emotionless, and there to choose death voluntarily when I determine that the position of the Führer can no longer be held. Click, click, click. The keys strike the paper. The woman typing is 25 years old. Her name is Traudl Junge. In less than 18 hours, the man sitting across from her will be dead by his own hand. And she will carry these words, this moment, this choice she made to serve him for the next 57 years of her life. But here's the question that will haunt her until the day she dies. How did a young woman who loved dancing and movies, who wasn't political, who didn't hate anyone, end up in a concrete tomb typing the final words of Adolf Hitler? And here's the question that should haunt all of us. Would we have done any differently? This is not a story about a monster. This is a story about the ordinary person who served the monster, and what that means for every single one of us. Munich, Germany, 1920. A baby girl is born and named Gertrude Humps. Her childhood is unremarkable. She grows up in a middle-class family. Her father works, her mother keeps house. Little Gertrude, who everyone calls Traudl, goes to school, plays with friends, dreams of the future like any child does. But Germany is changing around her. When she's 13 years old, Adolf Hitler becomes chancellor. Within months, the transformation begins. New flags hang from every building. New salutes are taught in schools. New youth groups form where children learn new songs about blood and soil and destiny. The radio broadcasts new messages. The newspapers print new truths. And gradually, imperceptibly, like a frog in slowly boiling water, normal becomes something else entirely. But here's what's crucial to understand about Traudl. She wasn't a fanatic. She didn't join the Nazi Party out of ideological fervor. She wasn't obsessed with politics or racial theories. According to her own testimony in the documentary Blind Spot, she was profoundly apolitical. She wanted to dance. She wanted to go to movies. She wanted a good job, a nice life, maybe marriage someday. Simple dreams, human dreams, the dreams of millions. In Germany in 1942, having those simple dreams meant not asking complicated questions. It meant going along. It meant not making waves. It meant choosing the comfort of ignorance over the danger of knowledge. 22 years old. That's how old Traudl was when she saw the job posting. Secretary wanted for important government office. Good pay. The posting didn't say who the employer was. She applied. Why not? It was a job. She needed work. Thousands of young women in Germany were looking for exactly the same thing. The interview was at the Wolf's Lair, Hitler's military headquarters in East Prussia. Only when she arrived did she discover who she'd be working for. Several young women were competing for the position. One by one, they were called in for a typing test. Adolf Hitler himself would dictate, and they would transcribe, live, on the spot, under his direct observation. Traudl was terrified. Her hands shook. She made mistakes. She fumbled the keys. She was absolutely certain she had failed. But Hitler chose her anyway. Out of all the candidates, he picked the nervous girl who made mistakes. Years later, she would wonder why. Was it precisely because she seemed harmless? Non-threatening, easily controlled? Or was it pure chance? The random whim of a man who made decisions about everything from secretaries to the systematic murder of millions with the same casual authority? We'll never know. But the choice was made, and Traudl Junge became one of Adolf Hitler's personal secretaries. For the next 3 years, she would work closer to the epicenter of evil than almost anyone who survived to tell about it. And here's the part that's most disturbing, most important, most relevant to understanding how this happened. At first, she liked him. Hitler was charming in private. He asked about her family with what seemed like genuine interest. He complimented her work. He had a German shepherd named Blondie that he absolutely doted on, playing with the dog, hand-feeding it treats, talking to it in a gentle voice. He stayed up late into the night, discussing architecture and art and his dreams for rebuilding Berlin into the most magnificent city in the world. He could be funny, telling self-deprecating stories about his failed early attempts to become an artist in Vienna. He treated his staff politely. He said, "Please and thank you. This is not a minor detail. This is perhaps the most important thing to understand. Evil doesn't always come wearing a sign that says, 'I am evil.' Sometimes evil asks politely for a cup of tea. Sometimes evil plays with dogs. Sometimes evil talks about art and beauty and magnificent dreams for the future. Sometimes evil is charming. Hannah Arendt, the philosopher who studied totalitarianism, would later call this the banality of evil, the terrifying, stomach-turning ordinariness of it all. The way that monstrous crimes are committed by people who also worry about their health, enjoy their pets, and have preferences about how they like their coffee. Traudl typed Hitler's letters to foreign leaders. She took dictation during military conferences. She traveled with him to various headquarters. She saw him every single day, and slowly, gradually, she began to see the other side, the rages that came out of nowhere, where he would scream for an hour straight, his face turning purple, spit flying from his mouth, accusing everyone around him of betrayal and incompetence. The paranoia, where he trusted no one, suspected everyone, saw conspiracies in every shadow, the increasingly delusional thinking where reality itself seemed to bend and warp around his beliefs until facts became whatever he needed them to be at that moment. Generals would deliver reports about battlefield losses, and he would accuse them of lying. Staff members would provide evidence of deteriorating conditions, and he would call them defeatists and traitors. The war was going badly, impossible. The enemy was stronger than anticipated, unthinkable. Germany was losing, treasonous talk. Reality had to conform to his vision, not the other way around. But even seeing all this, Traudl didn't leave. She didn't speak out. She didn't resist. She told herself she was just a secretary, just typing, just following orders, just doing her job. It's the same thing millions of Germans told themselves. Millions of ordinary people who weren't ideological fanatics, who didn't personally kill anyone, but who kept the machinery of the Third Reich running smoothly through their obedience and their silence. By 1945, the machinery was breaking down. The 1,000-year Reich that Hitler had promised was burning after just 12 years. American and British forces had crossed the Rhine and were driving deep into Germany from the west. Soviet armies, fueled by military strategy and an overwhelming hunger for revenge after what Germany had done to Russia, were crushing their way in from the east. The concentration camps were being liberated, revealing to a horrified world the full scope of the Holocaust. The systematic murder of 6 million Jews and millions of others, deemed undesirable by Nazi ideology, was being exposed in all its industrial, bureaucratic horror, and Adolf Hitler retreated into a concrete tomb beneath Berlin. The Führer bunker was designed to withstand bombing. It had walls several feet thick, 2 levels connected by a spiral staircase, rooms for staff, a small kitchen, Hitler's personal quarters, a conference room, everything needed to run a government and fight a war. But it couldn't withstand the inevitable. It couldn't stop the Soviet armies that were now fighting street by street, house by house, through Berlin itself. Traudl Junge described the atmosphere in the bunker as suffocating in every sense. The ventilation was poor, making the air thick and stale. The constant rumble of artillery created an unending vibration that you could feel in your bones. Diesel generators hummed 24 hours a day. The smell of concrete dust, unwashed bodies, and fear permeated everything. People spoke in hushed, careful tones. Everyone knew how this was going to end. The only questions were when and how. Hitler's daily military conferences became grotesque theater. He would stand over maps, moving colored pins that represented army units. Except most of those units no longer existed. They had been destroyed weeks ago. But on the map, they still stood ready. He would draw up elaborate plans for counterattacks, massive offensives that would turn the tide. Except there were no soldiers left to launch those attacks. No tanks, no ammunition, no food, no hope. Generals who had the courage to report the actual situation faced his fury. Some were dismissed on the spot. Some were arrested for defeatism. At least one was executed. Reality was not permitted in the bunker unless reality agreed with the Führer's vision. And Hitler himself was physically falling apart. He was only 56, but he looked ancient. His left hand shook so badly from what was probably Parkinson's disease that he had to keep it pressed against his side or hidden behind his back. He shuffled when he walked, dragging his feet like an old man. His skin had taken on a grayish color. He required thick glasses to read documents. He had trouble hearing. His diet consisted mainly of vegetables because his stomach couldn't handle much else. He was a wreck of a human being, but he still commanded absolute obedience. People still jumped when he spoke, still scrambled to fulfill his orders, still treated every word as law. The power of totalitarian authority doesn't require physical strength. It requires the obedience of those around it. And that obedience remained until the very end. April 20th, 1940, Hitler's 56th birthday. In better times, this would have been a massive national celebration. Parades, speeches, ceremonies across all of Germany. Now it was a grim gathering in a bunker while explosions shook the ceiling. His closest associates came to pay their respects, but they came with a plea: leave Berlin, fly south to Bavaria, go to the Alpine Redoubt, where resistance could continue. Don't die here in this hole. Hitler refused. He would remain in Berlin, he declared. He would personally direct the defense of the capital. This was presented as courage, as leadership, as noble determination. In reality, it was delusion. There was no defense to direct. The battle was lost. Germany was finished. April 2nd, the breaking point. During a military conference, Hitler learned that an SS unit he had been counting on for the defense of Berlin had failed to launch an attack. According to multiple witnesses, he exploded in the most violent rage anyone had ever seen from him. For nearly an hour, he screamed, his voice echoing through the bunker corridors loud enough that people several rooms away could hear every word. Everyone had betrayed him. Everyone had lied. The generals were incompetent. The German people had proven themselves unworthy of his leadership. On and on and on. Then suddenly the rage collapsed. Like a storm that passes and leaves only exhaustion behind, Hitler fell silent. When he spoke again, his voice was different, quieter, resigned. He announced that he would stay in Berlin until the end. He would not flee. He would not surrender. He would take his own life rather than fall into Soviet hands. This wasn't bravery. This was control. One last decision that was entirely his own. One last refusal to face consequences, because if he surrendered, he would be put on trial. His crimes would be listed. Evidence would be presented. The world would see him not as the great leader he believed himself to be, but as what he actually was, a murderer on an almost incomprehensible scale. He had seen what happened to Mussolini. The Italian dictator's body had been hung upside down in a public square in Milan just days earlier, mutilated and displayed for all to see. Hitler was determined to avoid that fate, so he chose suicide, and in doing so, he made sure his victims would never get the satisfaction of justice. April 28th. Soviet forces were now a quarter-mile away from the Reich Chancellery. The sound of machine gun fire could be heard clearly in the bunker. The end was measured in hours now, maybe days at most, and Hitler made a decision that surprised everyone. He would marry Eva Braun. Eva had been his companion for over a decade, but their relationship had been kept largely secret from the German public. Hitler's propaganda had always portrayed him as married to Germany, devoted only to his nation. Personal relationships were kept out of sight. But now, with death imminent, he agreed to the ceremony Eva had long desired. A minor city official named Walter Wagner was located somewhere in the chaos of burning Berlin and brought to the bunker. He was given a simple instruction: perform a civil marriage ceremony. The affair was brief and surreal. Adolf Hitler and Eva Braun stood before this terrified bureaucrat and spoke their vows while Soviet artillery shells exploded overhead. Afterward, there was a small wedding breakfast with champagne. People tried to make conversation, tried to act like this was a normal celebration. But how do you toast newlyweds when everyone knows they'll be dead within hours? But Hitler's primary focus that evening was not his wedding. It was his legacy. He wanted his version of events recorded. He wanted to control the narrative. He wanted to tell history what to think about him. And for that, he needed his secretary. Late in the evening of April 20th, While Soviet soldiers fought their way through Berlin streets less than half a mile away, Hitler summoned Traudl Junge to his study. He wanted to dictate two documents, his personal will and his political testament. For the next several hours, while the bunker trembled and distant explosions provided a constant percussion, Traudl sat at her typewriter and took down his final words. The personal will was relatively brief. It addressed his possessions, his art collection, his marriage to Eva Braun, and his wish that their bodies be cremated immediately after death to prevent them from falling into enemy hands. Standard legal language for the most part, but the political testament was something else entirely. In this document, Hitler attempted to write the conclusion to his own story, and it revealed everything about who he truly was, even in these final hours. He denied responsibility for starting the war. Instead, he blamed international Jewish conspiracies and the weakness of other nations who had refused to accept his demands. He expelled Hermann Goering and Heinrich Himmler from the Nazi Party for attempting to negotiate separate peace deals, calling their actions treasonous. He appointed Admiral Karl Dönitz as his successor and named a new government cabinet to carry on after his death. And through it all, Traudl later recalled, there was no remorse, no acknowledgement of the millions dead, no mention of the concentration camps, the gas chambers, the systematic extermination of entire populations, no acceptance of responsibility for the devastation of Europe, the tens of millions killed in the war he had started, no recognition of the suffering inflicted on countless families, children, innocent people. Instead, he portrayed himself as a victim, a misunderstood leader betrayed by incompetent subordinates, a visionary whose greatness would be recognized by future generations, a martyr dying for his beliefs. Click, click, click. Traudl's fingers typed every word. She later said his voice was often flat and monotonous, but occasionally it would flare with anger when discussing those who had betrayed him. But that anger wasn't directed at himself. It was always external, always someone else's fault. When the dictation finished around 4 a.m, Hitler signed both documents. Copies were made. 3 separate couriers were designated to attempt to carry these testaments out of besieged Berlin, to ensure that at least one copy would survive to reach the outside world. Most would fail. Most would be captured or killed trying to escape. But enough copies survived that Hitler's final words were preserved exactly as he wanted them. Traudl's work was done, but her ordeal wasn't over. April 30th dawned gray and smoky over Berlin. The sun was barely visible through the haze of burning buildings. In the bunker, time had an unreal quality. Day and night were meaningless concepts. There were no windows, only artificial light and the constant sound of war getting closer. Hitler didn't sleep after dictating his testaments. Instead, he made rounds of the bunker, saying personal farewells to staff members. These interactions were described by witnesses as strangely formal, almost ceremonial. He would shake hands with each person, thank them for their service, express some generic sentiment about sacrifice and duty, and then he would hand them a cyanide capsule, a gift for those who wished to avoid capture by Soviet forces, a way out if things became unbearable. Traudl received one of those capsules. She held it in her hand, this tiny glass vial containing death, and wondered if she would use it. Hitler's demeanor during these farewells was eerily calm. The rage and paranoia of previous days had burned away, replaced by a strange resignation. The decision was made, The plan was set. All that remained was execution. Around midday, Hitler took his final meal. He ate with his secretaries and his vegetarian cook. The food was simple, spaghetti with a light sauce. The conversation was minimal. What was there to say? Outside, the battle for Berlin raged. I said everyone waited for the inevitable. After lunch, Hitler and Eva Braun retired to their private quarters. They came out briefly to say final goodbyes. Hitler shook hands with staff members one last time. Traudl later described this moment as brief and strangely emotionless. He shook her hand. His grip was weak. His hand was trembling. He looked at her for a moment, but his eyes seemed focused somewhere else, somewhere beyond the concrete walls. No dramatic final words, no grand pronouncement, just a simple acknowledgement, a nod, and then he turned away. Eva Braun, who had been surprisingly cheerful during the wedding celebration, was composed and quiet. She had chosen to die with Hitler even though she had been offered multiple opportunities to escape to safety. Love? Loyalty? Fear? We'll never know her true motivations because she left no testament, no final statement. She simply walked into that room knowing she would never walk out. The door to Hitler's study closed. Those waiting outside stood in the corridor in tense silence. The rumble of artillery continued. Minutes passed, 5, 10, 15, and then a single gunshot. The sound echoed through the bunker, sharp, final, unmistakable. After a brief pause, Martin Bormann, Joseph Goebbels, and Hitler's personal valet Heinz Linge entered the room. They found Adolf Hitler and Eva Braun seated together on a small sofa. Hitler had shot himself in the right temple. The pistol lay near his feet. Blood had run down the side of his face and soaked into the sofa fabric. Eva had taken cyanide. She was slumped to the side. Her face, witnesses said, looked peaceful. The scene was described as surprisingly mundane. No drama, no grand staging, just two dead bodies in a small underground room while the world burned above them. Hitler's final written instructions had been explicit. The bodies must be burned immediately and completely. He was obsessed with preventing what had happened to Mussolini. He would not become a trophy. His corpse would not be displayed. His remains would not fall into enemy hands. The bodies were wrapped in blankets and carried up the stairs to the Reich Chancellery garden. Gasoline was poured over them. They were set aflame while Soviet shells continued to fall nearby, so close that the men carrying out this final duty had to duck for cover between trips. The cremation was incomplete, hastily conducted in the middle of an active battlefield. But it was enough to render the bodies partially unrecognizable. Later, Soviet forces would discover the charred remains and begin decades of speculation, propaganda, and conspiracy theories about Hitler's fate. But everyone who was actually there knew the truth. He was dead. He had chosen death over accountability. For Traudl Junge and the others remaining in the bunker, Hitler's death didn't bring relief or celebration. They were still trapped 30 feet underground while the Red Army fought its way overhead. The choice was simple: surrender or suicide. Joseph Goebbels, Hitler's propaganda minister and perhaps his most devoted follower, made a decision that revealed the true horror of Nazi ideology. He and his wife Magda decided not only to take their own lives, but to murder their 6 children first. 6 children, 6 innocent lives. The oldest was 12 years old. The youngest was 4. They were brought to the bunker by their parents. They were told they were there for safety. And on the evening of May 1st, while they slept, they were poisoned. Their parents wanted them to die in Hitler's Reich rather than live in a world without it. When Traudl Junge learned what the Goebbels family had done, something inside her broke. These were children she had seen playing in the bunker. She had talked to them, and now they were dead, murdered by their own parents in service to an ideology that valued itself more than human life. That moment, she later said, was when the full weight of what she had been part of began to truly sink in. But there was no time for reflection. Not yet. Because now the survivors had to make their own choice, die in the bunker or try to escape. Small groups began to form escape plans. They would wait until dark, then try to break through Soviet lines in the chaos of night fighting. Many were captured immediately. Some were shot. Some were killed by random artillery. But some, through a combination of luck and desperation, made it through. Traudl Junge was in one of those groups. Along with Hitler's pilot Hans Bauer, several SS officers, and other bunker staff, she attempted to escape on the night of May 1st. The details of that journey read like something from a nightmare. They crawled through rubble-filled streets while tracer fire lit up the night sky. They hid in basements while Soviet soldiers searched buildings. They moved from one destroyed building to another, always trying to head west away from the advancing Red Army. At one point, Traudl's group was caught in a firefight between German and Soviet forces. She threw herself into a shell crater and lay there for hours, not knowing if the next explosion would be the one that killed her. She watched people die. She stepped over corpses in the street. She saw Berlin burning, saw the complete destruction of the city she had known. The group fragmented. Some people decided to surrender. Some chose suicide. Traudl kept moving. For 3 days she wandered through the ruins of Berlin, sleeping in the destroyed buildings, drinking rainwater from puddles, eating whatever scraps she could find. She wore a Hitler Youth uniform she had found, hoping it would make her look younger, less important, less worth paying attention to. Eventually, she was captured by Soviet forces. She was terrified. She had heard stories about what Soviet soldiers did to German women. But the soldiers who found her were more interested in looting than violence. They took her watch, her few possessions, but they didn't harm her. She was processed through several detention centers, questioned repeatedly about her time in the bunker, about what she had seen, about Hitler's final days. The Soviets were obsessed with knowing every detail. They wanted to be absolutely certain Hitler was dead. They feared deception, feared that somehow he had escaped and would reemerge to rally resistance. Traudl told them everything she knew about the suicide, about the burning of the bodies, about the final hours. She had no reason to lie, no loyalty left to a dead man and a defeated regime. After weeks of detention, she was released. The Soviets deemed her a minor figure, a secretary who had typed documents but hadn't made policy decisions. She made her way back to Bavaria, back to what remained of her family, back to the fragments of a normal life. And then came the hardest part, learning to live with what she had done and what she had failed to do. For many years, Traudl Junge's story was relatively unknown. She tried to build a normal life. She got married. She worked various jobs. She tried not to think about those years, those choices, that bunker. When people asked about the war, she gave minimal answers. She had been young. She had been naive. She hadn't understood what was really happening. These were the excuses she told herself. And for a while they seemed sufficient. After all, she hadn't personally killed anyone. She hadn't worked in a concentration camp. She had just typed, just followed orders, just done her job. Millions of Germans said the same thing. But as the decades passed, as the full scope of the Holocaust became undeniable, as trials were held and evidence was presented and survivors told their stories, these excuses began to feel hollow. The turning point came when Traudl learned about Sophie Scholl. Sophie was a young woman who had been part of the White Rose resistance movement. She and her brother and friends had printed leaflets calling out the evils of the Nazi regime. They had distributed these leaflets at the University of Munich. They had been caught. And in 1943, at the age of 21, Sophie Scholl was executed. When Traudl discovered this story, she realized something that shattered her carefully constructed defenses. Sophie Scholl was the same age as her, born in the same year, lived in the same city, same country, same time period, same basic circumstances. But Sophie had made different choices. Sophie had seen the evil of the regime and had acted against it, even though she knew it would cost her life. Sophie had asked questions, had demanded answers, had refused to accept comfortable lies, and Sophie had died for it, while Traudl had chosen comfort, had chosen not to ask questions, had chosen the security of a good job and the safety of obedience, and Traudl had survived. This comparison haunted her for the rest of her life. If Sophie could see it, why couldn't she? Youth was no excuse. They were the same age. Ignorance was no excuse. The information was available for anyone willing to look. Fear was no excuse. Sophie faced the same regime and chose resistance anyway. The only real difference was choice. Sophie chose to act. Traudl chose to serve. In 2001, at the age of 81, Traudl Junge participated in a documentary called Blind Spot, Hitler's Secretary. The filmmakers interviewed her extensively about her experiences. And in those interviews, something remarkable happened. Traudl stopped making excuses. She stopped hiding behind youth and ignorance. She confronted her own culpability with brutal honesty. I was satisfied that I wasn't personally to blame and that I hadn't known about those things, she said on camera, her voice heavy with regret. I wasn't aware of the extent, but one day I walked past a memorial plaque. It was dedicated to Sophie Scholl, and I saw that she was born the same year I was, and that she'd been executed the same year I started working for Hitler. And at that moment, I really sensed that being young is no excuse, and that it might have been possible to find things out. She died in 2002, 57 years after that day in the bunker, carrying her guilt to the grave. So, what do we learn from Traudl Junge's story? What does this history have to teach us today here in WWII? In a world that seems increasingly divided, increasingly angry, increasingly willing to accept simple answers to complex questions. First, we learn that evil doesn't announce itself with horns and thunder. It doesn't come wearing a sign that says, "Follow me," and terrible things will happen. Evil offers opportunities. Evil provides jobs. Evil promises to make things better. Evil can be charming and polite and talk about beauty and art and magnificent dreams for the future. The Nazis didn't come to power by revealing their full agenda on day one. They came to power by exploiting economic crisis, by blaming Germany's problems on specific groups, by promising to restore national greatness, by telling people that they were victims who deserved better. And then gradually, step by step, they normalized the abnormal. They made the unthinkable thinkable. They turned neighbors against neighbors, friends against friends, citizens against entire populations. And they did it with the cooperation of millions of ordinary people who told themselves they were just doing their jobs. Second, we learn that just following orders is never an excuse. The Nuremberg trials after World War II established this principle in international law. You cannot escape moral responsibility by claiming you were simply obeying authority. Every individual has a duty to question, to resist, to refuse when ordered to participate in evil. Traudl Junge wasn't a concentration camp guard. She didn't personally kill anyone. She didn't make policy decisions. She just typed. But she typed the orders that others carried out. She typed the speeches that inspired hatred. She typed the documents that legitimized genocide. Her obedience, multiplied by millions of similar acts of obedience, made the machinery of the Third Reich function. And she spent the rest of her life understanding that her just typing was not innocent. Third, we learn that the choice between comfort and conscience is one that every generation faces. Today, right now, in our own time, we face versions of the same choice. Maybe not as extreme, maybe not as obviously evil, but the fundamental question remains the same. When confronted with injustice, will you speak out even if it costs you something? Or will you stay silent because it's easier, safer, more comfortable? These questions are not abstract. They're real. They're happening around us constantly. When we see discrimination but don't speak up because we don't want to make waves, when we know something is wrong but go along because everyone else is going along, when we prioritize our personal security over moral responsibility, these are the same choices, just on a different scale. Sophie Scholl chose resistance, even though it cost her life. She died at 21, but she died with her conscience intact. Traudl Junge chose comfort and obedience. She lived to 81, but she spent those decades wrestling with guilt and regret. Which life meant more? Which life should we aspire to emulate? Fourth, we learned that acknowledging our mistakes and our complicity, even late in life, matters. Traudl Junge could have taken her story to the grave. She could have maintained her excuses until the end. Instead, she chose to speak publicly about her guilt, about her failures, about the choices she regretted. That didn't undo the past. It didn't bring back a single victim. But it did serve a purpose. It warned the next generation. It provided a lesson in how ordinary people become complicit in extraordinary evil. Her final interviews are difficult to watch. Here is an elderly woman confronting the choices she made when she was young, acknowledging that those choices helped sustain a regime that murdered millions. There's no redemption arc, no happy ending, just honest recognition of failure and a plea that others not make the same mistakes. That honesty, painful as it is, might be the most valuable thing she left behind. The ruins of the Führer bunker still exist beneath Berlin, though much of it has been deliberately sealed and buried. The site is unmarked. There are no plaques, no memorials, no markers indicating what happened there. This is intentional. Germany has made a collective decision that this place should not become a shrine, should not become a destination for those who might want to celebrate what happened there. Instead, the memory is preserved in museums, in memorials to the victims, in education programs, in the thousands of books and films and documentaries that ensure this history is not forgotten. The focus is not on Hitler and his final hours, but on the millions who suffered and died because of the regime he led. And the focus is on the choices made by ordinary people. People like Traudl Junge. Because ultimately, this is not a story about Adolf Hitler. His evil, his crimes, his ideology have been documented exhaustively. We know what he did. We know what he believed. We know the consequences of his actions. This is a story about the young woman who typed his final words, about the choice she made to serve rather than question, about the decades she spent afterward trying to understand how she ended up in that bunker, in that moment, participating in that system. And it's a story about us, because we are all Traudl Junge. We all face versions of her choice every single day. Will we go along with things we know are wrong because it's easier? Will we stay silent in the face of injustice because speaking up might cost us something? Will we prioritize our comfort over our conscience? History is not something that just happened in the past. History is something we create every day through the choices we make, through what we accept, through what we resist, through what we refuse to tolerate. Traudl Junge spent her final years trying to warn us. Don't make my mistakes, she said. Don't choose ignorance because it's comfortable. Don't obey authority without questioning where that obedience leads. Don't wait until it's too late to realize that you were part of something terrible. Ask questions now. Demand answers now. Resist now. Because the time to stop evil is not after millions are dead. It's at the beginning, when the first signs appear, when the first lies are told, when the first injustices are normalized. The lessons of that bunker, of those final hours, of that young woman's lifetime of regret, echo across the decades with a simple message: never again. Not just never again to the Holocaust specifically, but never again to the pattern that led to it. Never again to the normalization of hatred. Never again to the machinery of dehumanization. Never again to the collective choice to look away, to stay silent, to go along. Every generation inherits this responsibility. Every individual makes these choices. The question is not whether we will face moments that test our conscience. The question is whether we will recognize those moments when they arrive, and whether we will have the courage to choose correctly. Traudl Junge learned this lesson too late, but her story gives us the chance to learn it now, while there's still time to make different choices, to ask harder questions, to refuse to participate in things we know are wrong. The bunker is sealed. The war is over. The Third Reich is dust. But the human capacity for both evil and good remains, and the choice between them remains ours to make. Every single day, in every single moment, starting right now.